The morning I decided to pretend I was poor was the same morning I realized my children no longer saw me as their mother, only as a source of money. It was a quiet Thursday. The house was too still, the kind of silence that echoes memories. I was sitting by the kitchen window, watching the garden I once tended with love. The roses were wilting, and so was I, in a way. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 68 years old, a retired nurse, a widow, and a mother of 3. For most of my life, I believed I had raised kind, compassionate children. I believed I had done everything right. But love can be blinding, especially a mother's love. When my husband passed away 10 years ago, he left behind not just a house and savings, but a lifetime of trust. We built this life together from nothing. 2 young dreamers who met in a hospital corridor. He used to say, "Evie, the kids are our legacy. Not the money, not the house. Them." And for years, I believed that too. Until the calls began. It started subtly. My eldest son, Martin, asking for a small loan to help his struggling business. Then my daughter, Julia, needing help with her mortgage. My youngest, Daniel, never called unless it was about tuition or bills. I gave and gave and gave. And each time they said they'd pay me back, but they never did. Money became the language between us. Birthdays became transactions. Holidays became uncomfortable meetings where I smiled while they eyed what I would give them next. I told myself it was fine. That's what mothers do. But one night, after a particularly cold Thanksgiving dinner where Julia complained that I hadn't upgraded the wine, something inside me cracked. That night, I went through my late husband's journal. I hadn't opened it since he passed. There in his handwriting, I found an old line he'd once told me. "Sometimes, Evelyn, people's true hearts are hidden under comfort. Take that away, and you'll see who they really are." It hit me like a whisper from beyond. That's when the idea began to form, quietly, dangerously. I wanted to know if my children loved me or the life I could provide. I needed to know before I left this world who they truly were. So I began my little act. First, I called Martin. I told him that I had invested badly and lost almost everything. I said the house might have to be sold, that I could barely cover my medical bills. He went silent for a long moment, then sighed and said, "Wow, Mom, that's rough. I wish I could help, but you know how things are with the business." His voice softened artificially before he added, "You should talk to Julia. Maybe she can take you in for a bit." I laughed through the lump in my throat and thanked him. Julia's response was worse. She said she was too stressed with the kids and that her husband didn't want extra financial pressure. She even suggested a retirement home, a nice one, she said, as if that softened the betrayal. Only Daniel hesitated. He said he'd call me back. He didn't. That night, I sat in my dimly lit living room, surrounded by the quiet ticking of the old grandfather clock. I stared at the family photos on the mantel. Birthdays, graduations, vacations, each one capturing a version of us that no longer existed. And I whispered to my late husband, "You were right. Maybe love needs to be tested to see if it's real." The next day I packed a small suitcase, grabbed some old clothes, and moved into a small rental apartment on the edge of town. I told my children I had no choice, that I couldn't afford to stay in the big house anymore. None of them offered to help me move. Not one. The first week was strange. I hadn't lived simply in years. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, and the refrigerator hummed too loudly. I spent evenings eating soup from a tin and reading library books. But something unexpected happened. I began to feel free. For the first time in decades, no one was asking me for anything. No one needed my approval, my money, or my constant forgiveness. But freedom was quickly replaced by heartbreak, because none of them visited. Weeks went by, and my phone remained silent. I used to think a mother could never be invisible to her children. but invisibility comes easy when you have nothing to offer. Then, one rainy afternoon, I received a knock on the door. It was Daniel, my youngest. His face looked tired, older than his 29 years. He held a grocery bag filled with bread, milk, and fruit. "Hey, Mom," he said awkwardly. I figured you might need some food." For a moment, I just stared at him, overwhelmed. He didn't say much, but that visit meant everything. He stayed for an hour, fixing my leaky faucet, making small talk about work. As he left, he hugged me tightly and said, "I'll come again soon, okay?" I nodded, too emotional to speak. That night I cried, not out of sadness, but gratitude. At least one of them still had a heart that remembered me. A few weeks later, I ran into Mrs. Harris, my old neighbor. She told me something that made my blood run cold. "Your daughter was at the country club last weekend," she said casually. "She mentioned how sad it was that you lost everything. People were gossiping about how you'd been reckless with money." I froze. So that was how they spoke of me now. A foolish old woman who wasted her fortune. I wanted to scream. I wanted to confront them. But I didn't. I had to see how far they would go. When Christmas came, I waited for an invitation that never arrived. I watched the snow fall outside my tiny apartment window, remembering the years I used to decorate a 12-foot tree while my grandchildren laughed around me. That year there was no laughter, just silence, and the sound of the wind. Then came the day that would change everything. I received a letter from the law firm that had handled my husband's estate. The attorney, Mr. Blake, had been a friend of my husband's for years. He was one of the few who knew about my little act. He called me and said, "Evelyn, are you sure you want to go through with this? Once it's done, there's no turning back." "Yes," I said firmly. "It's time they see the truth." The following week, I asked my children to meet me at the old house. I told them it was important, urgent even. They arrived, curious but indifferent. Martin parked his new SUV right in front. Julia came dressed as if for brunch, and Daniel looked anxious, unsure why we were gathered. I watched them from the window for a moment before stepping outside. Their faces were polite, detached. I felt my heart ache for the children they once were, the ones who used to run into my arms after school. Inside, I gestured for them to sit. My hands trembled slightly as I placed a folder on the table. "I know you've heard things," I began softly. "About me losing everything. About the house. About my money." Julia glanced at Martin with a smirk. "We just want what's best for you, Mom. Maybe you should sell the place before it gets worse." I nodded slowly. "You're right. And that's exactly why you're here. I'm selling it." Their faces shifted, shock, then anticipation. Martin leaned forward. "Wait, you're serious?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "And before I do, I wanted to make sure the right person inherits what's left." Julia smiled sweetly too quickly. "Of course, Mom. Whatever you think is fair." I looked at Daniel. He said nothing, just stared down at his hands. I took a deep breath. "I lied," I said quietly. "I never lost anything. Not the house, not the money, not a cent." Silence filled the room. Then Martin laughed nervously. "You're joking, right?" "I wanted to see who loved me for me," I continued. "Who would stand by me when I had nothing. And now I know." Their faces drained of color. I slid 3 envelopes across the table. "Inside are letters," I said. "One for each of you. What they say will determine what happens next." Julia was the first to open hers. I watched her expression twist as she read the single sentence inside. "You valued my money more than my heart, so you inherit neither." She slammed the paper down. "This is ridiculous, Mom!" "You can't." "I can," I interrupted softly. And I did. Martin opened his next. His letter read, "You chose pride over family, so I choose peace over guilt." He looked stunned, his jaw tightening as he muttered, "You're losing your mind." Only Daniel hesitated before opening his. His voice trembled as he read aloud. You stood by me when I had nothing. You'll stand beside me when I have everything. His eyes filled with tears. Mom. I reached for his hand and smiled through mine. You're the only one who remembered who I was. Julia stormed out. Martin followed, muttering curses under his breath. The door slammed behind them, leaving only Daniel and me in the stillness. He looked at me, voice shaking. You didn't have to do all this. Yes, I whispered. I did. Because love that depends on wealth isn't love, it's debt. After that day, I thought the storm had passed, but storms have a way of circling back. In the quiet that followed, I began to see the aftermath, not in their anger, but in their silence. Julia didn't call for weeks. Martin unfriended me on social media, blocked my number, and told mutual relatives I'd gone senile. They painted me as an ungrateful old woman who turned her back on her own children. Only Daniel visited every few days, helping with small repairs, bringing flowers, sometimes just sitting with me in silence. But silence can be deceptive. It can feel peaceful while hiding a growing ache underneath. Because deep down, I still loved them. Even after everything, a mother's heart doesn't stop hoping. I told myself they'd calm down, that time would heal it. But time, it seemed, was no longer on my side. That winter, my health began to slip. My hands trembled more than before, and the cold sank deeper into my bones. My doctor said it was early signs of Parkinson's. I laughed bitterly when I got home. Life has an odd sense of humor. I had spent my career as a nurse taking care of others, and now I could barely hold a cup without spilling. One afternoon, I called Daniel to help me with groceries. He came immediately, without question, and stayed to cook dinner. As we ate, I noticed how different he was from his siblings. He asked about my childhood, about Dad, about things they never cared to know. I told him about the time his father and I had danced in the rain outside this very house, the night we found out we were pregnant with Martin. We had been so young, so poor, and yet so rich in everything that mattered. Daniel smiled faintly and said, You know, Mom, you taught me more than you realize. I used to think money meant success, but now I think integrity does. His words pierced through me. In that moment, I realized something. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was becoming the kind of man his father would have been proud of. But fate wasn't done with us yet. One Sunday morning, Julia showed up unannounced. Her makeup was perfect, her hair immaculate, but her eyes were stormy. She walked in without waiting for me to invite her. We need to talk, she said sharply. I braced myself. She didn't sit. She stood near the window, arms crossed, voice shaking with restrained fury. Do you have any idea what you've done, Mom? Martin's marriage is falling apart because of you. He was counting on that inheritance to keep his business afloat. And me? I've been humiliated. People at the club are whispering that you cut us off because we're ungrateful. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? I stared at her, too tired to argue. Julia, I said softly, it's not about how you look. It's about what you became. Her face hardened. You think you're teaching us a lesson, but you're just bitter. Maybe Dad dying broke you more than we thought. That hit me where it hurt most. I could feel my throat tighten, but I refused to cry. Maybe, I said quietly, but at least I'm not broken by greed. She flinched. For a split second, I saw the little girl she used to be. The one who would crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and whisper, Don't let go, Mommy. I almost reached for her, but then she turned away, muttering, You'll regret this, before storming out. That was the last time I saw her for months. The following weeks blurred together in a fog of medication and long, lonely evenings. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at old photos, wondering when exactly love had turned into entitlement. Was it when I paid off Martin's first debt? When I covered Julia's failed investments? Or was it the moment I stopped saying no? Then came the letter. It was from a law firm, different from my husband's attorney. My heart pounded as I read it. Martin and Julia were contesting my estate, claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my assets. They wanted to seize control under the guise of protecting me. For a long while, I sat frozen. The betrayal was complete now. My own children had turned my act of love into ammunition against me. That night, Daniel came over. I showed him the letter. He read it, his jaw tightening, then looked at me with a mix of sadness and disbelief. They're trying to take everything? I nodded weakly. He took a deep breath and said, "Then we'll fight." I smiled faintly. "You don't have to, sweetheart." "I do," he said, "because they need to see what they've become." The court process was grueling. Sitting there under harsh fluorescent lights, listening to my own children argue that I was unstable, it was like attending my own funeral. They painted me as forgetful, paranoid, delusional. I watched as they lied under oath, pretending concern while their eyes gleamed with greed. But Daniel stood by me. He brought evidence, witnesses, even character statements from people I'd helped over the years. Mr. Blake, my old attorney, testified on my behalf, confirming my full mental clarity and the existence of my deliberate experiment. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, my voice trembling but clear. "I loved my children more than myself," I said. "Everything I ever did was for them. But love without boundaries becomes poison. I didn't fake being poor to humiliate them. I did it to see whether my love had meaning beyond money. And now I know. Sometimes the greatest heartbreak isn't being forgotten. It's realizing you raised people who forgot themselves." The courtroom fell silent. The judge ruled in my favor. My assets, my home, my independence, they remained mine, but the victory felt hollow. Martin and Julia left without a glance. Weeks passed. The house felt heavier now. I'd proven my point, but the cost was unbearable. I had dreamed that once the truth was out, maybe they'd feel remorse. But remorse is a luxury of conscience, and theirs seemed buried too deep. Then, one evening, Daniel showed up with something unexpected. A box. He placed it on the table and said, "Dad wrote these letters years ago. Mr. Blake found them in storage." I opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were 3 sealed envelopes, each with our names on them. I opened mine first. My husband's handwriting hit me like a wave of warmth and grief. "My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I've gone ahead of you. Remember that love must be tested not by wealth or comfort, but by loss. You'll know their hearts when the house grows cold." My tears stained the page. He had seen it coming all along. Then Daniel opened his. His voice broke as he read aloud. "Danny, my boy, you were always the one who saw your mother when others saw what she could give. Take care of her. And when she's gone, take care of her heart by living with compassion." Finally, I opened the last 2 envelopes, the ones addressed to Martin and Julia. I hesitated but read them aloud softly. To Martin, "You carry my name, but not my humility. Learn it before it's too late." To Julia, "You inherited your mother's strength, but not her kindness. Find it, and you'll find yourself." We sat in silence for a long while after that. Months passed quietly. I stopped expecting calls from them. My world became smaller, but oddly lighter. I tended my garden again, grew tomatoes and daisies, filled my days with small joys. Daniel would come by every Sunday, sometimes with his girlfriend, sometimes alone, always smiling. Then, one late spring afternoon, I heard a car pull up. My heart raced when I saw Julia standing at the gate, clutching a small bouquet of lilies. She looked different, thinner, softer somehow. She hesitated before walking up to the porch. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. I didn't answer. I just looked at her, trying to read her eyes. She swallowed hard. I lost a lot these past months. The house, my job, and when I had no one left, I realized I'd lost you long before that. For the first time in a long time, I saw sincerity in her face. She stepped closer, tears brimming. I'm sorry, Mom. I was awful. I forgot what really mattered. I felt something break open inside me. I took her hand and said quietly, Sometimes, Julia, we have to lose everything before we understand what love is. We stood there, crying softly, two women who had hurt each other deeply, one from pride, the other from disappointment. And in that fragile moment, forgiveness began to take root. After Julia's visit, something inside me began to thaw, slowly, cautiously, like ice melting under a hesitant sun. For months, the house had been nothing but echoes and dust, but that night, after she left, I noticed how the silence felt a little less sharp. It was still there, yes, but it wasn't cruel anymore. It was waiting. I didn't tell Daniel right away. I wanted to see if Julia's apology was real or just another performance to get back into my will. But the following week she came again, not in fancy clothes, not in a car that smelled of expensive perfume. She arrived by bus, hair tied up in a messy bun, carrying a small box. I found these while cleaning out my old house, she said softly, setting the box on the table. Inside were old family photos, the kind we used to take with disposable cameras back before phones made everything instant. There was one of her and Martin as kids, sitting on the lawn covered in mud. I remembered that day. They had been making pies out of dirt and rainwater. I'd scolded them then, but looking at the photo now, I laughed. Julia smiled shyly. You always hated when we tracked mud inside. You said it ruined the carpet. I didn't hate it, I said, touching the picture gently. I just didn't want you slipping on the floor. But I'd trade all the clean carpets in the world for one more day of muddy footprints. She looked down, ashamed. I don't deserve your kindness, I sighed. Maybe not, but love isn't something you earn, Julia. It's something you either give back or lose forever. That night she helped me cook dinner. Nothing fancy, just soup and bread. But we talked, really talked, for the first time in years. She told me about the pressure she felt to maintain her lifestyle, the fear of being seen as less than her friends. How she'd mistaken money for respect. And I listened. Not as the mother she'd disappointed, but as a woman who once made her own share of mistakes. Over the next few weeks, Julia came regularly. Sometimes to bring groceries, sometimes just to sit with me in the garden. There were awkward silences, but also quiet laughter. I could see her trying, and that mattered more than I could ever say. But one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of copper and rose, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. My heart sank when I saw Martin step out. He looked thinner, paler, and older. Not in years, but in spirit. There was a bitterness in his eyes, but also exhaustion. He stood on the porch, his hand hovering uncertainly over the doorbell, before I opened the door myself. Mom, he said flatly. Martin, I replied. He glanced past me, noticing Julia sitting inside. His expression tightened. So you forgave her? She came back, I said simply. That's what forgiveness starts with. He gave a cold laugh. You think this is about forgiveness? You humiliated us, Mom. You turned us into villains in front of the whole family. Do you have any idea how people look at me now? Maybe you should ask yourself why that bothers you so much, I said gently. He stared at me, his jaw clenching. You've changed. No, I said. I finally stopped pretending. He looked around the house, the same house he'd once demanded I sell, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Maybe regret. Maybe jealousy that Julia had found her way back before him. Then he said something that froze me to the core. You think you taught us a lesson. But all you did was prove that money does control everything. Even your love. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. No, Martin. You proved that yourself. I never stopped loving you. I just stopped funding your mistakes." His face twisted, half anger, half pain. For a second, I thought he might yell, but instead, he turned and walked away without another word. The sound of his car fading down the street was like a door closing on a chapter I wasn't ready to end. That night, Julia sat with me on the porch as I stared into the dark. "He'll come around," she said softly. I nodded, though I didn't believe it. Some wombs need time. Others need humility. Martin had neither yet. As months went by, I saw more of Julia and even more of Daniel. They started coming together on weekends, helping me plant new flowers in the yard. Slowly, my garden came back to life. Bright tulips, wild daisies, and my husband's favorite, white roses. I like to think of them as symbols, proof that even after everything dies, something beautiful can still grow again. Then, one afternoon in late summer, I received a letter from Martin. It was short, written in his usual stiff handwriting. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I don't expect forgiveness, I just want to talk. M." My heart raced as I read it. Julia found me sitting at the table, letter trembling in my hand. "He wants to come," I whispered. When he arrived a few days later, he looked different. Humbled, even fragile. There were dark circles under his eyes, his once flawless suit wrinkled, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. He sat across from me and stared at the table for a long moment before speaking. "The business went under," he said finally. "I lost everything." I didn't say anything, he went on. "I kept blaming you for cutting me off. But maybe you were trying to save me from myself." I watched him carefully, searching for manipulation, but all I saw was truth. The mask he'd worn for years had cracked. Beneath it was the boy who used to follow me around a garden, asking endless questions about the world. He looked up, eyes glistening. "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know how I became this person." I reached across the table and took his hand. "You forgot who you were, Martin. But now you have the chance to remember." He nodded slowly, tears falling freely now. Do you think Dad would be ashamed of me?" I shook my head. "No. He'd be proud you finally told the truth." That night, for the first time in years, all three of my children sat together at my table. We ate simple food, shared old stories, and laughed until our sides hurt. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even fully healed. But it was real. As the evening faded into night, Daniel leaned back and smiled. "You know, Mom, you might be the only person who could pull off faking bankruptcy just to teach people about love." We all laughed, but beneath it was understanding. My experiment, as cruel as it had seemed, had brought them face to face with their own reflection. And in that reflection, they'd seen something worth changing. Weeks later, Julia suggested we restore an old family tradition, our Sunday dinners. Each of them would take turns cooking, no fancy dishes, no gifts, just presents. The first one felt awkward, the second easier, and by the third it felt like coming home again. It wasn't long before the grandchildren joined too, shy at first, then warm and giggly. I watched them play in the same yard their parents once did, their laughter floating through the air like music I thought I'd forgotten. But even as joy returned, part of me remained haunted. Because I knew time was slipping faster now, my body grew weaker, the tremors stronger. There were days I couldn't hold a cup, couldn't write in my journal without smudges. One night, after everyone had left, I sat alone by the fireplace and whispered to my husband's photo. "They came back, love." It took breaking everything apart, but they came back. Tears rolled down my cheeks. I think I can rest easy now. Still, there was one thing left to do. I called Mr. Blake and told him I wanted to finalize my will, but not as revenge this time, as closure. When my children arrived a week later, I explained everything calmly. The house will be sold after I'm gone. The proceeds will be divided equally between the three of you. But I said, smiling faintly. Only if you continue to share Sunday dinners. If even one of you stops showing up, the inheritance goes to charity. They laughed through tears, realizing I wasn't joking. That's cruel, Mom, Julia said. It's love, I corrected. Because love isn't just about giving. It's about showing up. That night, as they left, Daniel turned back at the door. You know, Mom, you didn't just test us. You saved us. I smiled softly. No, sweetheart. You saved yourselves. The following year became the most peaceful of my life, and, in its own quiet way, the most beautiful. I woke each morning to the soft sound of birds on the windowsill, the scent of coffee wafting through the air, and a sense of gratitude that I hadn't felt in decades. My hands trembled more now, and sometimes I forgot names for a moment or two, but my heart had never been clearer. Every Sunday, without fail, my children came. It didn't matter if it rained, if someone was busy, or even if there had been arguments that week, they still showed up. At first I thought they were doing it just to honor my condition for the inheritance. But, over time, something shifted. The dinners became less about duty and more about connection. They started cooking together, laughing over burnt dishes and shared stories. Julia's eldest daughter, Grace, began setting the table, while Daniel taught the younger ones to play cards. Martin, surprisingly, became the one who always insisted on saying grace before the meal. He'd bow his head and say, "For everything we took for granted, and everything we found again. Thank you." The first time he said that, my throat tightened so much I couldn't even whisper, "Amen." One spring evening, while everyone was gathered outside watching the kids chase fireflies, I sat in my favorite chair, watching them from the porch. The twilight made everything glow. Their laughter, the flickering lights, the way Julia threw her head back and laughed like she hadn't in years. I closed my eyes and imagined my husband sitting beside me, his hand resting on mine. "You did it, Evelyn," I could almost hear him say. "You brought them home." I smiled through tears. Maybe he was right. Maybe all the pain had led to this one moment, imperfect, but whole. But life, as always, had one more lesson waiting. By late summer, my body began to decline more quickly. The tremors grew worse and my steps slower. One afternoon while tending the roses, I fainted. When I woke, I was in a hospital bed, the room filled with the faint beep of monitors and the low hum of machines. Daniel was there, his eyes red from crying. Julia and Martin sat beside him, holding hands, something I hadn't seen in years. Julia reached for my hand. "You scared us, Mom," she whispered. I smiled weakly. "I just needed a nap, that's all. The doctor said I'd had a mild stroke. It could have been worse, but I'd need rest. When I returned home, they didn't let me lift a finger. For the first time, they took care of me. They cleaned, cooked, laughed, sometimes argued, but always together. It was as if the roles had finally reversed and I was learning what it meant to be loved without conditions. One night, while everyone was asleep, I woke and went to the window. The moonlight poured across the yard, illuminating the roses I'd planted with Daniel. My hand shook as I leaned on the sill, whispering, "Thank you." I wasn't sure who I was thanking, God, my husband, or life itself, but I felt peace in the knowing that it no longer mattered. Weeks passed. My strength waned, but my heart stayed light. The children began recording our dinners on video, for the grandkids, they said. I knew it was their way of preserving the time we had left. Sometimes, they'd catch me staring too long at them, smiling through tears. I'd wave them off and joke, "Don't look at me like that. I'm not gone yet." Then, one golden afternoon, something remarkable happened. Martin came over alone. He was holding a small, worn leather book, my husband's old journal. I finished reading it, he said quietly. There was a page in the back I don't think you ever saw. He handed it to me, his hands trembling. Inside was a note dated the year my husband passed. If love is ever lost among us, Evelyn, remind them of this. Family isn't about who inherits your house. It's about who keeps it warm. I pressed my hand against the page, tears blurring my vision. He always knew how to say it, didn't he? I murmured. Martin nodded. He did. And I just want you to know, Mom, I'm sorry it took losing everything to learn that. I smiled, brushing away his tears with unsteady fingers. That's what lessons are for, sweetheart. They don't come when we want them. They come when we're ready to change. He stayed for hours that evening, helping me organize old photo albums, laughing at his childhood drawings. When he left, he kissed my forehead, something he hadn't done since he was a boy. After he drove off, I sat in the dim light of the living room, flipping through one of the albums. There were photos of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary mornings, the kind of moments that seem unremarkable until you realize how precious they really were. And in that silence, I realized something profound. Pretending to be poor hadn't been a test for them. It had been a mirror for me. To see that love, stripped of pride and wealth, was still possible. A few weeks later, my health took another turn. This time, I knew it was serious. I didn't fear it. I'd lived long enough to know that endings are simply another kind of beginning. The last Sunday dinner we had was beautiful. The table was full, the house alive with chatter and music. I watched my children, older now, wiser, but finally whole. Daniel caught me watching and smiled. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "I'm just listening," I replied, to the sound of everything I ever wanted. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I wrote a letter. It wasn't for lawyers or wills. It was for them, for my 3 children. My loves, if you're reading this, I'm already resting. Don't cry for me. I've had a full life. I've known heartbreak, forgiveness, and the miracle of family finding its way home. Remember this: wealth can build a house, but only love can make it a home. Keep showing up for each other. Keep the Sunday dinners. And keep the laughter alive. That's my inheritance to you. With all my love, Mom. When I finished, I sealed the envelope and placed it inside my husband's journal. Then I looked around the house one last time, the house that had witnessed love, greed, betrayal, and finally, redemption. A week later, I passed peacefully in my sleep. The children found the letter during the first Sunday dinner without me. They read it together, hands intertwined, tears falling freely. Julia whispered, "She always got the last word." Daniel laughed through his tears. "Yeah, and somehow it's always the right one." They decided to keep the dinners going, not because of the will, but because it felt wrong not to. Over time, the grandchildren grew up with those gatherings, unaware that they had once been born from a mother's desperate attempt to teach her children what love truly meant. And maybe that's how it should be. Love remembered not as a lesson, but as a legacy, because, in the end, I didn't just pretend to be poor. I pretended to lose everything, only to help my children rediscover what they had lost all along. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need reminding that love and family are worth more than gold. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this one, where truth, forgiveness, and love always find their way home.